I used to think wealth was mainly about adding more income, more opportunities, more investments, more upgrades, more proof that life was moving in the right direction. Age has a way of exposing childish theories. The truth I trust now is much less flattering to the ego and far more useful to the balance sheet. What you do not need stops owning you. That is the first sentence I want fixed in your mind, not because it sounds elegant, because it is expensive to forget. Most people spend the first half of adult life trying to raise their standard of living without noticing that they are also raising the amount of life they must continuously feed. A bigger apartment is not only a nicer apartment, it is a new monthly obligation. A fuller wardrobe is not only a wider set of options, it is more maintenance, more decisions, more replacement, more money quietly disappearing into things that were supposed to make life feel easier and somehow leave it feeling heavier. More subscriptions, more upgrades, more convenience, more digital noise, more possessions, more social comparison. The pile grows, then the person says he needs the salary to maintain the pile, without admitting that the pile is the reason the salary became emotionally non-negotiable in the first place. That is not prosperity. That is dependency wearing tasteful clothes. I have spent enough of my life around money to know that dependency does not always look desperate. Sometimes it looks polished, sometimes it lives in a good neighborhood, wears expensive shoes, speaks clearly, and still wakes up every morning needing the machine to keep paying because the machine is what holds the performance together. I have never liked performances. I prefer structure. And the structure beneath a surprisingly large number of wealthy-looking lives is much weaker than the public understands. Good money comes in, good money goes out, the person remains in motion and calls the motion success. Years pass, the paycheck is higher, the assets are not, the complexity is higher, the freedom is not. The whole thing feels like movement because there are receipts to prove something happened. But movement is not wealth. Movement can be the enemy of wealth if it never leaves a residue. That is the mother line of this whole piece. What you do not need stops owning you. Once you see that, minimalism stops sounding like an aesthetic preference and starts sounding like financial intelligence. I am not talking about bare walls, joyless rooms, or some childish theater of deprivation. I have no respect for deprivation as a costume. I am talking about reducing noise until capital can finally hear itself think. A noisy life is expensive in more ways than one. It costs money directly, yes, but it also costs judgment. Too many objects create too many decisions. Too many decisions create fatigue. Too much fatigue creates bad spending, lazy investing, emotional living. And the illusion that chaos is normal because chaos has become familiar enough to feel like personality. That is where the first mechanism begins. I call it the clutter tax. People think clutter is about space. It is really about attention. A closet full of clothes you do not wear is not only wasted fabric, it is a daily toll booth. Every morning you stand there negotiating with too many options, many of which no longer fit your taste, your body, or your actual life. The negotiation consumes energy. Then you wonder later why you feel mentally overdrawn before the day has even begun. I have always admired the idea of reducing trivial decisions so that deeper ones can be approached with a full mind. Steve Jobs wore the same style constantly. People turn that into a personality detail, which is what the public always does with useful principles. They make them decorative. The real point was more serious. Every decision has a cost. If you spend too much mental capital on what is trivial, you borrow energy from what is consequential. That is why a smaller wardrobe can be wealth. Building even before it saves a single dollar. It reduces decision fatigue. It narrows replacement pressure. It weakens the consumer itch that thrives on novelty for novelty. Yes' sake, it also changes what shopping becomes. When you have fewer things and like them more, purchases become less emotional and more deliberate. The closet becomes a tool rather than a museum of your past moods. This applies far beyond clothing. Every duplicate system, every unused app, every scattered account, every half-adopted routine, every object maintained only because you bought it once and feel guilty abandoning it. All of it taxes your attention. I do not care whether something sparks joy as a slogan. I care whether it quietly demands maintenance, thought, money, or guilt out of proportion to what it returns. That is the real accounting. Which brings me to the second mechanism, account sprawl. There is a particular kind of modern person who confuses optimization with accumulation of systems. 8 bank accounts, 3 credit cards for different reward categories, introductory bonuses chased like trophies, high-yield accounts with conditions, minimum balances, qualifying direct debits, cashback rules, login screens, tiny rate advantages that require a whole second career in administration just to preserve them. The person feels smart. Often he is merely busy. I have never believed in complexity for tiny gains. If the complexity itself begins consuming the mind, that should be making larger decisions. A system that saves you a little interest but costs you clarity can be a bad trade. Money management is not supposed to become a circus act in which you juggle ever more accounts while congratulating yourself for the performance. I prefer fewer channels and cleaner vision. One place to spend, one place to invest, one place to keep emergency cash. The exact structure can vary, but the principle should not. If you cannot see the whole field quickly, you are more vulnerable than your spreadsheet tells you. Clarity itself is a form of wealth. The simpler the plumbing, the harder it is for money to disappear into neglected corners, missed conditions, forgotten subscriptions, or self-congratulatory over-engineering. I have watched many people spend far more time managing their money than actually growing it. That is backward. Management should support growth, not replace it. When money organization becomes an elaborate hobby, it often means you are avoiding the harder work of increasing the gap between what you earn and what you spend, then directing that gap toward ownership. That gap, by the way, is where the real game begins, not the thrilling game, the real one. The third mechanism is investment noise. I call it the 99% problem. The financial world produces far more opportunities than any sane person should consider. Hot stocks, clever friends, internet geniuses, chat groups, podcasts, predictions, themes, sectors, cycles, stories. The ordinary investor, especially the insecure one, begins to mistake exposure to more ideas for progress. He follows everything. He feels plugged in. He knows the names. He checks constantly. He has opinions on semiconductors in the morning, lithium by noon, and small-cap biotech by dinner. He calls this engagement. He calls it taking investing seriously. Often it is just another clutter problem. I have never seen much value in knowing about everything if that knowledge turns a person into a nervous spectator who cannot distinguish signal from emotional static. The average investor does not underperform because he lacks access to opportunities. He underperforms because he keeps reacting to too many of them. More ideas lead to more action leads to more mistakes. Frequent buying and selling create friction, fees, taxes, second guessing, and the psychological trap of believing you must always be doing something intelligent because the market is always doing something dramatic. Most of that is theater. The minimalist approach to investing is not anti-intellectual. It is anti-noise. Cut the field down to what matters. Broad, low-cost funds, productive businesses you actually understand. Contributions that happen automatically, a time frame long enough that daily opinion becomes irrelevant. Ignore the overwhelming majority of what is offered to you as opportunity because most of it is not opportunity. It is stimulation. Stimulation is one of the most expensive products in modern finance. It gives the feeling of proximity to wealth while often moving you further from it. I built my fortune through concentration at key moments, yes, but never through restless novelty. Even when I took large positions, they were taken from a foundation of patience, research, and refusal to worship movement. The amateur thinks intelligent investing feels active. The grown allocator understands that long stretches of informed inaction are often where the real money lives. The fourth mechanism is quality over rotation. This one sounds boring, which is one reason it works. Buy the best version once, not of everything, of the things that stay in your life. People who are secretly expensive often tell themselves they are being frugal by buying cheaper versions of the same thing over and over. The cheaper shoes that wear out twice as fast. The cheap knife that makes daily life mildly irritating for years. The bag replaced 3 times. The tool that breaks. The appliance that turns into repair after repair. The sofa that looked like a deal until it began sagging like a bad moral compromise. A sensible person does not spend lavishly on status, but he also does not confuse cheap now with cheap over time. Cost must be measured against lifespan. Use frequency, satisfaction, and replacement probability. The cheapest version of a daily object is often the most expensive when judged across a decade. This is true financially and emotionally. When you buy the better version once, you remove future shopping, future dissatisfaction, future replacement decisions, future waste. Future excuses, good quality narrows the field of future noise. That narrowing is valuable. Now let me turn to something subtler. The fifth mechanism is digital carryover. A surprising amount of modern spending begins before the purchase itself. It begins in identity rehearsal. You follow the accounts. Wedding pages long after the wedding is over. Design pages from the season when you thought you might renovate. Fitness pages from the self you once intended to become. Luxury pages from a life you are not actually living. Aspirational pages from a social class you are privately trying to impress, even when no one asked you to audition. This is one of the quietest ways people keep themselves poor. They keep feeding old identities through their attention long after those identities stop serving a real life. Then the mind begins feeling lack where there was no lack before. It invents missing pieces. It notices an absence because a feed manufactured an expectation that is not neutral. Attention precedes appetite. If you feed appetite all day, do not act surprised when your money starts acting as though your real life is insufficient. I have always believed you must unfollow the life you are no longer living. This is not only a mood intervention, it is a spending intervention. The mind reaches for what it rehearses. If you keep rehearsing luxury weddings, fashion refreshes, aspirational interiors, and endless personal reinvention, your money will eventually try to obey the script. The person who is becoming wealthier quietly often lives with a much cleaner attention diet than the person who is perpetually trying to feel current. He is not less alive, he is less interruptible. He does not let old fantasies and commercial narratives keep renting space in his head long after their usefulness expired. That is minimalist wealth in the modern age. Not just fewer objects, fewer psychic invoices. The sixth mechanism is the raise capture. This one may be the most important of all. Most people think wealth begins when income becomes large enough. I do not believe that. Wealth begins the first time an increase in income fails to be entirely consumed by lifestyle. That is the inflection point. Not the raise itself, but whether the raise survives. The world is set up to make sure it usually does not. You get paid more, a better apartment begins to feel reasonable. Nicer meals stop feeling indulgent. A gym membership you barely use starts sounding like a healthy person's natural expense. A slightly better holiday becomes the minimum level at which life feels earned. Within 6 months, the entire increase has been metabolized by a life that barely changed structurally at all. This is one of the great scams, not because anyone tricked you with a gun, but because the whole culture colludes in treating this absorption as normal maturity. You are doing better, so of course your visible life should upgrade. That assumption quietly destroys fortunes. The move I admire is much simpler and much rarer. When income rises, invest the increase before your emotions get used to it. Not all of it necessarily, though much more of it than the average person believes possible. 50%, 60-80, the exact number depends on your life, but the principle does not. Capture the raise before your habits annex it. This works because the old life was already functioning. You were surviving on the former salary. That means the new money has disproportionate power if you can stop yourself from treating it as proof that your standard of living deserves immediate decoration. This is how the gap begins to widen quietly. And once the gap widens, wealth can finally start receiving real fuel. A person living on 50 while earning 80 has something very different from a person living on 78 while earning 80 from the outside. The second may look more prosperous. On paper, the first is building a weapon. That difference compounds. The seventh mechanism is time as capital. People talk about money constantly and time almost never in the same sentence, which is one reason they stay poor longer than they should. Time is not only precious, it is allocative. How you spend it determines what kind of money you will later earn, what kind of thinking you will later possess, and whether your calendar belongs to purpose or to the requests of everyone around you. The financially weak often leak time the same way they leak money. Saying yes because no feels impolite, accepting meetings that should have been emails, doing favors by reflex, filling a week with motion and calling it productivity, being so available that the whole day becomes a series of interruptions. This has direct financial cost. A calendar is a budget with hours instead of dollars. Every yes is a purchase. The question is whether you chose it or whether the world chose it for you. There was a time when I realized other people were spending my schedule for me, not maliciously, casually. That is how it usually happens. Each request seems small. Each obligation seems manageable. Each social courtesy seems harmless. Then one day the calendar belongs more to everyone else's priorities than to your own compounding. That is financial damage in slow motion, because time directed toward noise is time not directed toward increasing skill, deep work, reading, planning, building, resting intelligently, or simply seeing your own life clearly enough to make better decisions. A man who guards his hours often ends up guarding his wealth better too. He understands something the crowd often misses. Money can be replenished, a wasted afternoon cannot, which means time, in many moments, is more valuable than cash, not abstractly. Literally. That is why saying no is often a wealth habit, not because you are selfish, because uncontrolled access to you is expensive. The eighth mechanism is seasonal reset. People love the drama of the one-time declutter, a heroic weekend, bags to charity, drawers emptied, closets purified, light flooding into the room like a moral reward. Then life resumes and the space slowly refills because the original habits were not examined. Only the original evidence of the habits was removed. That is why I do not trust one-time clarity. I trust recurring confrontation, declutter every season. Not because the house cares, because you do. Every few months you should be forced to look at what came in. What remains unused, what you bought out of mood, what identity you were trying to rent, what convenience quietly accumulated, what no longer matches the actual person you are. This is a financial practice disguised as housekeeping. Each review restores friction to consumption. It reminds you that every object had a price, a story, and an opportunity cost. People who never revisit their clutter also rarely revisit their assumptions. They keep buying from old selves. The seasonal reset interrupts that. It says once again, show me what your habits have built. Show me what you keep without need. Show me what money became. That confrontation changes how the next purchase feels. The item in the store is no longer isolated from the landfill of prior impulses in your own home. That is useful pain. The ninth mechanism is purchase friction. Most shopping today is engineered to remove the pause between desire and transaction. That is not an accident. The whole machine profits from compressing impulse into purchase before reflection has time to interfere. Saved cards, one-click checkout, shopping apps on the front screen, push notifications, last chance, only 2 left. Your size is selling out. The architecture is not designed to help you decide well. It is designed to prevent you from deciding at all. The answer is not stronger willpower speeches. The answer is inconvenience. Make buying annoying, delete the shopping apps, remove the stored payment details, force yourself to use the browser, log in, enter the card, feel the drag, create the pause. Most desires are weak enough that 30 seconds of inconvenience exposes them as passing mood rather than genuine need. That is all you need. A little drag, a little time for the mind to cool and recover its authority. People talk about friction as though it were the enemy of modern life. In the right places, friction is one of the great financial gifts. It gives reason a chance to catch up with appetite. And once you begin using friction, you discover something almost embarrassing. A large percentage of your previous spending never rose to the level of considered desire at all. It was merely low resistance behavior. That is how quietly money disappears. Now let me pull all this together. Because these termites are not isolated, they are a system. Comfort keeps you from stretching. Urgency keeps you from thinking. Proximity keeps mediocrity feeling normal. Leakage keeps money from gathering. Borrowed identity turns spending into self-defense. Lottery thinking turns patience into waiting. Tomorrow turns intention into biography. That system is strong. Strong enough to hold millions of people in place while they imagine external villains are the whole problem. They are not the whole problem. The quieter problem is self-permission. That is why the escape is not a dramatic reinvention. It is awareness first, then design, then consistency. See the habits clearly, create friction where you need friction. Automate what should not depend on inspiration. Simplify what steals mental overhead. Change the room if the room keeps normalizing financial weakness. Reduce the number of decisions your future depends on. Then wait while consistency compounds into leverage. Leverage is what people always want first. Passive income, big returns, asset growth optionality. They want the fruit while ignoring the root. But leverage arrives later. First comes design, then repetition, then self-trust, then small reserves, then clearer thought, then the first serious gap between what comes in and what goes out, then the first investments that are actually protected from self-sabotage, then gradually systems start working without daily heroics. That is real leverage, not magic earned structure. I have looked for shortcuts most of my life. I never found one that lasted. The public loves miracles because miracles let them preserve their habits. Wealth usually does not ask for a miracle. It asks for a long obedience in the same direction. That sentence may be the least glamorous true thing I know about money. Now return to the beginning. If someone followed you for the next 30 days, what future would they predict? Would they see a life being quietly owned by comfort, urgency, leakage, and performance? Or would they see a person narrowing the field, raising the quality of his attention, reducing the number of leaks? Investing earlier than comfort prefers saying no with more confidence and turning ordinary months into the early architecture of wealth. That is the real audit. Not what you think, not what you intend, what repeats, because repetition becomes identity, and identity becomes finance long before the account balances catch up enough to make it visible. That is why the chains of habit are too light to be felt until they are too heavy to be broken. I have said that for years because it remains true in almost every domain that matters. The good news is that chains can still be interrupted early, termites can still be seen, and once you see them, the damage stops feeling mysterious. Then rebuilding begins. Not next quarter, not when the market calms down, not when life becomes generous enough to feel easy. Now that is all the opening anyone ever really gets. And if you use it, one day the future someone would have predicted by following you. For 30 days will no longer be small, confused, and reactive. It will be deliberate, quiet, structured, freeing, and very expensive for anyone to mistake for luck.